December 11th, 1939, 3:47 a.m. The Rat Road, eastern Finland. Minus 43 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it kills. And right now, somewhere in the frozen darkness ahead, 8,000 Soviet soldiers are dying. Not from bullets, not from bombs, from something far more terrifying. They're being eaten alive by ghosts. Lieutenant Viktor Karpov pressed his back against the frozen metal of his truck's cabin, his breath crystallizing before it even left his lips. 3 days ago, he'd been part of the 44th Rifle Division, 18,000 strong, rolling toward the Finnish town of Suomussalmi with enough firepower to level a small country. They had tanks, they had artillery, they had the might of the Soviet Union behind them. Now they had nothing but corpses and confusion. The attack had come from nowhere. One moment, the convoy was crawling through the forest road, engines straining against the Arctic cold. The next moment, silence. The truck ahead of Karpov simply stopped. No explosion, no gunfire. Just stopped. Then the screaming started. Karpov had seen men die before. He'd fought in the Finnish forests for 11 days now, but he had never seen anything like this. White shapes materialized from the snow itself. 1 second, empty forest. The next, Finnish soldiers in white camouflage, moving like liquid, firing from angles that seemed impossible. They appeared, they killed, they vanished. And by the time Karpov's men returned fire, they were shooting at nothing but pine trees in their own frozen fear. But what happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life, if he lived that long. The Finns weren't just attacking, they were chopping, cutting the convoy into pieces like a butcher sectioning meat. Roadblocks appeared behind them, more appeared ahead, and suddenly 18,000 Soviet soldiers weren't an army anymore. They were firewood. If you're finding this story as gripping as I hope you are, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, what these Finnish ski troops did next will absolutely blow your mind. This is the untold story of how a tiny nation with almost no resources brought Stalin's military machine to its knees using nothing but skis, snow, and the most terrifying guerrilla tactic of World War II. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand why 8,000 Soviet soldiers were being systematically dismembered on a frozen Finnish road, you need to understand what brought them there in the first place. And it all started with a lie. November 26th, 1939, 4 days before the invasion. In the village of Mainila, on the Finnish-Soviet border, something happened. Or rather, something didn't happen, but the Soviet Union claimed it did. Soviet radio announced that Finnish artillery had shelled the village, killing 4 Soviet soldiers and wounding 9 others. It was completely fabricated. Soviet commanders had staged the incident themselves, firing their own artillery into their own territory to create a pretext for war. We know this now from declassified Soviet documents. At the time, the Finns knew it too. Their artillery batteries weren't even in range of Manila. They offered to form a joint investigation. Moscow refused. 4 days later, at precisely 6:50 a.m. on November 30th, 1939, nearly 500,000 Soviet soldiers crossed the Finnish border on 4 separate fronts. 21 divisions, over 2,000 tanks, nearly 1,000 aircraft. Joseph Stalin expected this to be a military parade, not a war. He gave his generals 10 days to capture Helsinki. What happened next would become one of the greatest military humiliations in modern history. And it would all center on one word that the Soviets would learn to fear more than any bomb or bullet. Motti. But before we get there, you need to understand exactly what the Finns were up against. Because on paper, this wasn't just an uneven fight, it was a death sentence. Finland in 1939 had a total population of 3.7 million people. The Soviet Union had over 170 million. The Finnish army could field approximately 300,000 troops. The Soviets deployed 450,000 on the first day alone, with hundreds of thousands more in reserve. The Finns had 32 tanks, total. The Soviets brought over 6,000. The Finnish Air Force had 114 aircraft, most of them obsolete. The Soviets launched with nearly 2,500 modern planes. Every military analyst in the world looked at these numbers and reached the same conclusion. Finland would fall within weeks, possibly days. A British newspaper ran a headline that captured the global sentiment perfectly. Finland cannot win. And on the surface, they were right. What nobody understood, what Stalin himself criminally underestimated, was that the Finns had something no amount of tanks or artillery could overcome. They had winter, they had terrain, and they had a tactic that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. December 7th, 1939, the forest road near Suomussalmi. Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the Soviet 163rd Division through a pair of German-made binoculars. Even from this distance, he could see that something was wrong with the enemy column. The Soviets had been advancing for a week now. On the first day, they'd moved with the confidence of conquerors. Tanks at the front, infantry columns stretching back for kilometers, supply trucks loaded with enough ammunition to fight for months. They were following the Rate Road, a narrow path through dense forest that connected the Soviet border to the strategic crossroads at Suomussalmi. Now, on day 7, that confidence had evaporated. The tanks had stopped. Silasvuo had watched it happen with growing fascination. Finnish soldiers had felled trees across the road at a dozen points, forcing the armored vehicles to halt while engineers cleared the obstacles. But every time the Soviets stopped to clear one barricade, Finnish ski patrols attacked their flanks. The Soviets would deploy infantry to chase the attackers, only to discover that men on foot couldn't catch men on skis in waist-deep snow. By day 5, the Soviet advance had slowed to a crawl. By day 6, it had stopped entirely. And that's when Silasvuo realized what he was looking at. The Soviet 163rd Division wasn't an army anymore. It was a target. "They've done it to themselves," Silasvuo muttered, lowering his binoculars. His adjutant, Lieutenant Koskinen, looked at him quizzically. "Done what, sir?" Silasvuo pointed at the road below. "They've created a Motti." The word came from Finnish forestry. And when loggers needed to measure firewood, they stacked it into cubic meter sections called Mottis. The term had a practical, almost mundane quality to it. But what Silasvuo was about to do with that word would be anything but mundane. "Look at them," he said. 18 kilometers of men, tanks, and trucks, all lined up on a single road. They can't move forward because we've blocked them. They can't move backward because their vehicles can't turn around. They can't leave the road because the snow is too deep for their trucks and their tanks sink in the forest ground. Silasvuo turned to face his officer. "They're not a military column anymore. They're firewood, and we're going to chop them into pieces." Over the next 72 hours, Finnish forces executed one of the most devastating tactical operations of the 20th century. But what made the Motti tactic so effective wasn't superior firepower. It wasn't advanced technology. It was a fundamental understanding of something the Soviet commanders had completely ignored. In the Finnish winter, the forest itself is a weapon. Here's what the Soviets didn't understand about warfare in Finnish Karelia. The temperature in December 1939 regularly dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal becomes so cold that touching it with bare hands tears flesh. Engines won't start unless they're kept running continuously, which burns fuel at catastrophic rates. Weapons jam, lubricants freeze solid. Men who fall asleep without shelter simply don't wake up. The forest roads were narrow, often just wide enough for a single vehicle. Dense pine forests pressed in on both sides, their branches weighted with snow. The snow itself was waist deep in places, sometimes deeper. A man trying to walk through it would exhaust himself within minutes. A truck trying to leave the road would bog down instantly. A tank, even the vaunted Soviet T-26, would sink into the soft forest floor like a ship going down. But on skis, a Finnish soldier could move at 30 kilometers per hour across the same terrain that trapped Soviet vehicles. Finnish troops had been skiing since childhood. Many of them could shoot accurately while moving. They could appear from the forest, strike, and vanish before the enemy could even identify their position. The Soviets were stuck on a road. The Finns owned everything else. And Silasvuo was about to show them exactly what that meant. The attack began on December 11th. Finnish ski patrols had already identified every Soviet supply truck, every field kitchen, every ammunition depot along the 18-kilometer column. Now, operating in small groups of 8 to 12 men, they went hunting. The first strike hit the Soviets at multiple points simultaneously. Finnish soldiers emerged from the tree line, fired concentrated bursts at identified targets, and disappeared back into the forest before the enemy could organize a response. Supply trucks burst into flames, communication lines were cut. Officers who tried to rally their men were picked off by Finnish marksmen positioned in the trees. But the killing blow came from the roadblocks. Under cover of darkness, Finnish engineers had moved into position at 6 points along the Soviet column. Using felled trees, abandoned vehicles, and anything else available, they sealed the road. Not just in front of the column, not just behind it. At 6 separate points within it. When dawn broke on December 12th, the Soviet 163rd Division was no longer a single fighting force. It was 6 separate pockets of men, each one cut off from the others, each one surrounded by Finnish forest that had suddenly become a wall. The first Motti had been created, and now the chopping could begin. Private Antti Mäkinen was 19 years old on the morning of December 12th. He'd been a conscript for 8 months, a trained ski soldier for 6. In civilian life, he'd been a farmhand from a village near Oulu, someone who'd never traveled more than 50 kilometers from his birthplace. Now he was lying in the snow on the outskirts of the Suomussalmi road, watching Soviet soldiers freeze to death. "They've stopped their trucks," whispered Sergeant Nurmi from beside him. "Look at the exhaust." Mäkinen looked. Nurmi was right. The Soviet vehicles that had been running continuously for days, burning precious fuel to keep their engines from freezing solid, had finally gone silent. Either they'd run out of fuel, or someone had ordered them to conserve what little remained. It was a death sentence. "How long?" Mäkinen asked. Nurmi shrugged. "In this cold, the engines will seize within hours. After that, those trucks are nothing but steel coffins." But it wasn't just the vehicles that were dying. Through his binoculars, Mäkinen could see Soviet soldiers huddled around makeshift fires, burning anything they could find. Wooden ammunition crates, vehicle parts, even their own clothing. Some of them weren't moving at all, just sitting motionless in the snow. "Sergeant, are those men dead?" Nurmi nodded slowly. "Frozen. Happened overnight. They fall asleep by the fire, and the fire burns out, and they just don't wake up." He paused. "The ones that are still alive will try to surrender soon. That's when we hit them." Mäkinen felt something twist in his stomach. Hit them when they're trying to surrender? The sergeant turned to look at him, and Mäkinen saw something in the older man's eyes that he hadn't expected. Not cruelty. Sorrow. "We don't have enough men to take prisoners, boy. We don't have enough food to feed them. We barely have enough ammunition to keep fighting." Nurmi gestured at the frozen column below. "There's 18,000 of them down there and 3,000 of us. If we let them surrender, we lose. If we let them regroup, we lose. If we show them any mercy at all..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not a battle. It was a systematic dismemberment. Finnish ski troops attacked the isolated Mottis day and night, never giving the trapped Soviets a moment's rest. They targeted specific objectives with surgical precision. Field kitchens first, because hungry soldiers can't fight. Fuel depots next, because cold soldiers can't survive. Officers third, because leaderless soldiers can't organize. And always they attacked from the darkness. The Finns had an overwhelming advantage that the Soviets simply couldn't counter. They knew these forests. Many of the Finnish soldiers had grown up hunting in these exact woods. They knew which trails connected where, which frozen lakes could support a man's weight, which spots offered the best firing angles. The Soviets, by contrast, were city boys and Ukrainian farmers, men who'd never seen a winter like this, who'd never learned to move on skis, who'd been told they'd be greeted as liberators by oppressed Finnish workers. Instead, they were being greeted by ghosts. The most terrifying aspect of the Finnish attacks wasn't the killing itself, it was the uncertainty. Soviet soldiers never knew when the next attack would come. They'd be huddled around a fire trying to warm their frozen hands, and suddenly a volley of gunfire would erupt from the trees. By the time they grabbed their weapons, the attackers were gone. They'd try to sleep, and machine gun fire would rake their position at 3 a.m. They'd send out patrols to find the enemy, and the patrols would simply vanish. One Soviet survivor later wrote in his diary, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting the forest itself. The trees move, the snow has eyes, and every night fewer of us wake up." The psychological effect was devastating. Men began seeing Finnish soldiers everywhere, in the shadows between trees, in the shapes of snowdrifts, in their own nightmares. Some soldiers shot at their own comrades in the darkness. Others simply stopped fighting altogether, sitting in the snow and waiting to freeze. And through it all, the Finns kept chopping. By December 20th, the 163rd Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Soviet commanders in Moscow, alarmed by the reports filtering back from the front, made a decision that would compound the disaster. They sent reinforcements. The 44th Rifle Division was one of the best equipped units in the Soviet army. Originally raised in Ukraine, its soldiers had been handpicked from more experienced regiments. They had modern equipment, capable officers, and explicit orders from Stalin himself: break through to Suomussalmi and rescue what remained of the 163rd Division. They had no idea what they were walking into. On December 14th, the 44th Division began its advance along the Rata Road. Their commander, a young officer named Alexei Vinogradov, pushed his men forward at a grueling pace. His column stretched for 25 kilometers through the frozen forest, a massive serpent of men, vehicles, and artillery crawling toward Suomussalmi. Colonel Siilasvuo received the intelligence on December 15th. Another division, another 18,000 men, another column trapped on a single forest road. Another Motti. Siilasvuo was not a man prone to smiling. But when his adjutant delivered the news, witnesses reported that the colonel's weathered face cracked into something approaching satisfaction. They're sending us more firewood, he said. How thoughtful of them. The destruction of the 44th Division would become the textbook example of the Motti tactic, studied in military academies around the world for generations afterward. But before we get to that horror show, I need to tell you about the men who made it possible. Because the Finnish ski troops weren't just soldiers, they were something the Soviet military had never encountered before, an entire army that could disappear. Meet the ghost soldiers. In the Soviet Union, conscription was mass mobilization. You took every man of fighting age, put him in a uniform, gave him a rifle, and pointed him at the enemy. Individual skill mattered less than overwhelming numbers. One soldier might die, but 10 more would take his place. Finland couldn't fight that way. They didn't have the numbers. What they had instead was something far more valuable: specialization. Finnish ski troops had been trained specifically for Arctic warfare. They could ski for hours without rest, covering distances that would take regular infantry days to march. They learned to build snow shelters that were virtually invisible from the air. They practiced firing their rifles while moving at speed, a skill that required extraordinary coordination and countless hours of practice. But their most important training had nothing to do with combat at all. They learned to be invisible. Finnish soldiers wore white oversuits that blended perfectly with the snow. They wrapped their weapons in white cloth to eliminate any dark shapes that might catch an enemy's eye. They moved in small groups, traveling through the forest in single file so their tracks would look like the path of a lone animal. They never built fires during the day, when smoke would be visible. They never spoke above a whisper within 2 kilometers of enemy positions. And they had learned something the Soviets hadn't figured out. In the Finnish winter, sound carries for incredible distances. A man's voice can travel a kilometer through the frozen air. The crack of a rifle echoes for miles. Even the crunching of boots on snow can be heard from hundreds of meters away. So the Finnish ski troops learned to be silent. They communicated with hand signals. They moved on their skis with a gliding motion that produced almost no sound. They tied cloth around their equipment to prevent any metallic clinking. When they attacked, they did so in coordinated silence, appearing from the trees like specters and vanishing before the echoes of their gunfire faded. The Soviets called them White Death. It was an appropriate name. The most famous of these ghost soldiers was a man named Simo Heiha. He was a farmer's son from the Karelian village of Rautjärvi, just 30 kilometers from the Soviet border. He'd served his mandatory military service years earlier, but when the invasion came, he volunteered immediately. Over the next 100 days of fighting, Heiha would become the deadliest sniper in recorded history. His confirmed kill count was 505 soldiers with his rifle alone. Add in the kills he made with his submachine gun during close combat, and the number rises to over 700. He achieved this record while fighting in the same brutal conditions that were killing Soviet soldiers by the thousands. Temperatures that fell to minus 40 degrees, snow that rose to a man's waist, darkness that lasted for 20 hours a day. But what made Heiha truly terrifying wasn't his accuracy, it was his methodology. Heiha didn't use a telescopic sight on his rifle. He'd noticed that, in the extreme cold, the temperature difference between a sniper's body heat and the freezing air would cause telescopic lenses to fog up, giving away his position. So he used only the rifle's iron sights, which required him to expose less of his head above the snow. He would lie motionless in a snowbank for hours, waiting for a target. He packed snow into his mouth to prevent his breath from creating a visible cloud. He positioned himself so that the muzzle flash of his rifle wouldn't be visible against the bright snow. The Soviets hunted him relentlessly. They sent counter-sniper teams. They called in artillery strikes on his suspected positions. They offered bounties for his death. They never caught him. On March 6, 1940, a Soviet soldier got lucky. An explosive bullet struck Heiha in the face, destroying his jaw and leaving him for dead. He survived, barely. But the war ended before he could return to action. He would live for another 62 years, dying peacefully in 2002 at the age of 96. But his legend lived on. And men like him were everywhere in the Finnish forests. Now back to the Right Road, because what happened there between December 28, 1939 and January 8, 1940 would become one of the worst military disasters in Soviet history. Commander Vinogradov had been pushing his men hard for 2 weeks. The 44th Division had covered nearly 200 kilometers through frozen wilderness, their supplies dwindling with every passing day. The Finns had been harassing them constantly. Small attacks at dawn and dusk, sniper fire from invisible positions, supply trucks that mysteriously exploded in the night. But Vinogradov pressed on. He had his orders. What he didn't know was that Colonel Silas Vuo had been waiting for him. The Finnish commander had already destroyed the 163rd Division. Now he had 3,000 exhausted, but experienced ski troops positioned along the Rot Road, waiting for the 44th to walk into their trap. On December 28th, it happened. The 44th Division was stretched along 25 kilometers of forest road when the Finnish attack began. As before, the Finns didn't try to assault the column head-on. Instead, they sealed it. Roadblocks appeared at 8 different points along the column, cutting it into 9 separate segments. Each segment contained between 1,000 and 3,000 Soviet soldiers, all of them suddenly isolated, all of them surrounded by frozen forest that had just become a killing ground. The first night was chaos. Finnish ski patrols attacked all 9 Mottis simultaneously, using the same tactics that had annihilated the 163rd Division. They hit supply trucks, communication centers, officer quarters. They attacked in waves, striking and withdrawing, never giving the Soviets a chance to organize a coherent defense. By dawn on December 29th, Commander Vinogradov had lost contact with most of his division. His radio operators were dead or wounded. His supply lines had been cut, and hundreds of his soldiers had already frozen to death in the night. But the worst was yet to come. January 1st, 1940, the temperature dropped to minus 43 degrees Celsius. In the largest Motti, containing nearly 4,000 Soviet soldiers, panic had set in. They had no food. Finnish raiders had destroyed their field kitchens days ago. They had no fuel. Their trucks sat frozen and useless, their engines seized solid. They had no hope of rescue. The sounds of fighting from the other Mottis told them that the entire division was under attack. And they had no way out. Some soldiers tried to escape through the forest on foot. They died within hours, frozen solid in the waist-deep snow. Others tried to fight their way through the Finnish roadblocks. They died in concentrated crossfire from prepared positions. Still others simply gave up, sitting in the snow and waiting for the cold to take them. The Finns watched it happen. Private Mäkinen, who had been fighting for 3 weeks straight by this point, later wrote about what he saw. We stopped attacking the large Motti on January 3rd. There was no need anymore. The cold was doing our work for us. Every morning we would ski past the Soviet positions and count the new bodies. Sometimes they were huddled in groups around dead fires. Sometimes they were sitting upright, their eyes frozen open. Sometimes they were piled on top of each other, as if they had tried to use their dying comrades for warmth. I had seen death before. I had caused death before, but I had never seen anything like this. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were statues, a frozen museum of human suffering. And we had created it. Commander Vinogradov tried one last desperate gamble on January 5th. He gathered what remained of his headquarters staff, perhaps 200 men, and attempted to break out through the Finnish lines. He abandoned his troops, his equipment, everything. The Finnish patrols tracked him through the snow for 2 days. On January 7th, they caught him. But that decision would cost Vinogradov more than his freedom. When Stalin learned that the commander of the 44th Division had abandoned his men, his response was characteristically brutal. Vinogradov was court-martialed, convicted of cowardice, and executed by firing squad. His name was erased from Soviet military records. For decades afterward, the Soviets officially denied that the Battle of Suomussalmi had ever happened. But the evidence was undeniable. When the fighting finally ended on January 8, 1940, the numbers told a story that Stalin couldn't suppress forever. The Soviet 163rd Division had entered the battle with approximately 18,000 soldiers. Fewer than 4,000 survived, and most of those were wounded or suffering severe frostbite. The Soviet 44th Division had brought nearly 18,000 more. Fewer than 2,000 made it out alive. Combined losses, over 30,000 Soviet soldiers killed, captured, or frozen to death. Finnish losses, 902 men dead. The ratio was almost 35-1. But the numbers don't capture the full scale of the Finnish victory, because it wasn't just men that the Soviets lost at Suomussalmi. The Finns captured 43 Soviet tanks, more than the entire Finnish tank force at the start of the war. They captured over 70 artillery pieces, enough to arm several Finnish regiments. They captured thousands of rifles, machine guns, and mortars. They captured hundreds of trucks and vehicles, providing the Finnish army with a desperately needed logistics boost. And they captured something even more valuable: information. Among the dead Soviet officers, Finnish intelligence found detailed maps of Soviet war plans, communication codes, and supply schedules. They found Stalin's original timeline for the invasion, the one that had predicted the capture of Helsinki within 10 days. And they found evidence of something that would change the international perception of the Soviet military forever. The Red Army wasn't invincible. Word of Suomussalmi spread quickly. Western newspapers ran headlines celebrating the Finnish victory. Military analysts who had predicted Finland's collapse now scrambled to explain how a tiny nation had humiliated the world's largest army. Volunteers from across Europe, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, even the United States began arriving in Finland to join the fight. And in Moscow, Joseph Stalin was furious. The Soviet leader had expected a quick, clean victory. Instead, his forces were being slaughtered by ski soldiers in white suits. His tanks were useless in the frozen forests. His numerical superiority meant nothing when his men couldn't even stay warm. Stalin responded the only way he knew how, with more force. In January and February 1940, the Soviets launched a massive offensive on the Karelian Isthmus, the narrow strip of land between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. This was different terrain, open ground that favored Soviet armor and artillery. Unable to use their Motti tactics in the flatlands, the Finns were forced into a conventional defensive war. And despite their incredible bravery, the numbers finally caught up with them. By late February, the Finnish defensive lines were crumbling. Soviet artillery had pulverized their fortifications. Soviet tanks had broken through at multiple points, and most critically, Finnish soldiers were simply running out of ammunition. Colonel Siilasvuo, the architect of the Suomussalmi victory, was transferred to the Karelian front in early February. But even his skills couldn't change the fundamental mathematics. Finland had 300,000 soldiers. The Soviets had sent over 1 million. On March 12, 1940, the Finnish government sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Finland was forced to cede approximately 10% of its territory to the Soviet Union, including the entire Karelian Isthmus and the city of Viipuri. Over 400,000 Finnish civilians were forced to relocate, abandoning homes their families had occupied for generations. But Finland remained independent. That distinction might seem small today, but consider this. Every other nation that resisted Soviet expansion in this era, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, was eventually absorbed into the Soviet Empire. Finland alone maintained its sovereignty, its democracy, its freedom. And the reason for that can be traced directly back to the frozen forests of Suomussalmi. The Winter War cost the Soviet Union dearly. Official Soviet figures, long suppressed, eventually revealed the truth. Over 126,000 Soviet soldiers died in the 105 days of fighting. Another 270,000 were wounded. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed. Thousands of aircraft were lost. Against a nation 1/50th its size, the embarrassment was so severe that Stalin launched a massive reorganization of the Red Army immediately after the war. Commanders were replaced. Training programs were overhauled. Equipment was redesigned for Arctic conditions. The lessons of Finland, particularly the lessons of the Motti tactic, were studied intensively. Ironically, this reorganization may have saved the Soviet Union from destruction. When Nazi Germany invaded the USSR in June 1941, they expected to face the same incompetent, poorly led army that had frozen to death in Finland. Instead, they encountered a military that had learned from its mistakes, a military that had been forged, in many ways, by the very defeats it had suffered against Finnish ski troops. The Motti tactic itself lived on. Military academies around the world still study the Battle of Suomussalmi as a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. The principles that Colonel Siilasvuo developed, isolating enemy forces, attacking supply lines, using terrain as a force multiplier, became foundational concepts in asymmetric warfare. You can see echoes of the Motti in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in any conflict where a smaller force has faced a larger one. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Finnish ski troops isn't tactical at all. It's inspirational. The Winter War proved something that tyrants throughout history have tried to deny, that superior numbers and superior firepower don't guarantee victory, that a free people fighting for their homeland can achieve the impossible, that courage, creativity, and adaptation can overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The Finns didn't win the Winter War in the conventional sense. They lost territory. They lost lives. They were forced to sign a peace treaty on Soviet terms. But they survived. And in doing so, they taught the world a lesson that still resonates today. Private Antti Mäkinen, the young farmhand who had watched Soviet soldiers freeze to death on the Raide Road, survived the war. He returned to his village near Oulu, where he worked his family's farm until his death in 1987. He rarely spoke about his experiences during the Winter War. But his granddaughter, in an interview decades later, recalled one thing he had told her. He said that the Russians thought they were fighting soldiers. They weren't. They were fighting every man, woman, and child in Finland, every farmer, every teacher, every shopkeeper. They were fighting people who would rather freeze to death in the snow than live under tyranny. And that, he said, was something no army could ever defeat. Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo was promoted to general after the war. He continued to serve in the Finnish military during the Continuation War against the Soviet Union, which began in 1941 and ended in 1944. He died in 1979, remembered as one of the greatest military commanders in Finnish history. Simo Heiha, the deadliest sniper who ever lived, returned to farming after recovering from his wounds. He refused all interviews for decades, uncomfortable with the attention his wartime service had brought him. When he finally agreed to speak about his experiences in his later years, reporters asked him how he had managed to kill so many enemy soldiers. His answer was characteristically Finnish. "I did my duty." The frozen forests of Suomussalmi are quiet now. The roads that once carried Soviet tanks and supply trucks have been paved and modernized. The sites of the great Mottis are marked with small memorials, stone monuments that record the names of Finnish soldiers who died defending their homeland. If you visit in winter, as some tourists do, you'll find the landscape much as it was in 1939. The snow still falls in deep drifts. The pine trees still press close on either side of the narrow roads. The cold still bites with the same savage intensity. And if you stand very still in the silence of a Finnish winter night, you might almost hear it. The whisper of skis on snow. The ghosts of the White Death, still patrolling the forests they never surrendered. Still teaching the world that freedom is worth any price. That's the story of how Finnish ski troops became deadlier than 10 divisions. That's the story of the Motti tactic, the strategy Stalin couldn't counter. And that's the story of a tiny nation that proved, against all odds, that some things are simply unbreakable. Because in the end, the Soviets learned what every invader eventually learns when they try to conquer a people fighting for their homes. The forest always wins. But I want to leave you with one final thought, one final detail that captures, perhaps better than anything else, the spirit of what happened in those frozen woods. When Finnish soldiers cleared the Rate Road after the battle, they found something extraordinary among the wreckage of the Soviet 44th Division. Diaries. Hundreds of them. Soviet soldiers had written letters to their families, journal entries about their experiences, final messages that they knew might never be delivered. Finnish intelligence officers collected these documents for analysis. What they found wasn't military information. It was humanity. Letters to wives and children back home. Descriptions of the cold, the fear, the desperate desire to survive. Prayers written by men who had been told that religion was the opiate of the masses, but who turned to God when death came calling. And in diary after diary, the same question appeared. A question that Soviet soldiers asked themselves over and over as they froze and starved in the Finnish forests. Why are we here? They had been told they were liberating Finland from capitalist oppression. They had been told they would be welcomed as heroes. They had been told that Finnish workers would rise up to join them in the worldwide communist revolution. Instead, they had found a nation that wanted nothing more than to be left alone. A nation that would fight to the death for the right to live free. A nation that turned the winter itself into a weapon against invaders. And in the end, that was the real victory of the Motti tactic. Not the tanks captured, not the divisions destroyed, not even the thousands of enemy soldiers killed. It was the question. Why are we here? Because any army that has to ask that question is already lost. The Finns never had to ask. They knew exactly why they were fighting. They were home, and they were never going to leave. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you think about the incredible power of people who refuse to surrender, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world where we sometimes forget what courage really looks like, the story of the Finnish Winter War is a reminder. It's a reminder that the size of the fight in the dog matters more than the size of the dog in the fight. It's a reminder that superior technology and superior numbers don't guarantee anything. And it's a reminder that some things, freedom, homeland, the right to live as you choose, are worth fighting for. No matter the odds, no matter the cost. The Finnish ski troops knew that, and now so do you. The Motti tactic wasn't just a military strategy. It was a philosophy. Divide your enemies, isolate them, cut them off from everything that gives them strength, and then, piece by piece, dismantle them. It works on battlefields. It works in business. It works in life. Whenever you face an overwhelming challenge, remember the lesson of Suomussalmi. Don't try to beat your opponent head on. Don't try to match their strength with your own. Instead, change the terms of the fight. Use your environment. Attack their weaknesses. Be patient, be persistent, and never, never give up. Because that's what the Finns did in the winter of 1939. They didn't try to win the war by Soviet rules. They wrote their own rules. And then they made the Soviets play by them. Minus 40 degrees Celsius. Waist-deep snow. 3,000 soldiers against 18,000. And at the end of it all, the frozen forests of Finland were still Finnish. That's the power of strategy. That's the power of determination. That's the power of people who know what they're fighting for. And that's the story of the Motti, the tactic Stalin couldn't counter, the strategy that turned firewood into freedom. and the legacy that still echoes in the snows of Finland today. If you've made it this far, you're part of a special group. People who appreciate deep dives into history. People who want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means. I make content like this because I believe these stories matter. I believe that the lessons of history can change our lives if we're willing to learn from them. So if you want more stories like this, stories of courage, strategy, and the incredible things human beings can accomplish when their backs are against the wall, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Because there are more stories like this. So many more. And I can't wait to tell them to you. Until next time. Stay curious. Stay brave. And never, ever underestimate the power of a few determined people fighting for what they believe in. Because that's what changes history. That's what the Finnish ski troops understood. And that's what we can all learn from the frozen forests of Suomussalmi. The Motti tactic. Stalin's nightmare. Finland's triumph. And a lesson for the ages.